Nepal is currently in the eye of the storm. A simple one, or maybe not so simple. A ban on a long list of social networks has sparked the biggest wave of protests in decades in the country, which has already claimed more than 20 victims. In terms of fatalities, hundreds of people have been injured. And as a culmination, the resignation of the country's prime minister. However, it doesn't seem like the young people who are the main force behind this movement want to stop there. And the truth is, this goes far beyond a sudden outbreak of youth violence. It actually has much deeper roots. It has to do with the widespread frustration among the population. Yes, mainly among young people, especially because of the many cases of corruption that are rampant in the country. But of course, we can't analyze what's happening in Nepal. Not to mention the geopolitical struggle between China and India, and also the Western influence which is also present. In short, today we're going to analyze what's really happening in Nepal and why this small Himalayan country has recently become the center of global attention. As usual, let's start from the beginning. On September 4th, the then government of Nepal banned a whole range of social networks. Specifically, 26 social networks, including some extremely well-known ones such as Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp. That is, we're talking about social networks, yes, but also about messaging services. An attempt to silence the population, which in fact has had the completely opposite effect as a consequence. Generation Z, young people have become enraged and have taken to the streets to demand the resignation of the government, and it doesn't seem like they want to stop there. Right now, the violence is reaching its highest levels in what began as peaceful marches quickly escalated in violence and resulted in the siege of parliament. Government buildings burned, hundreds injured, dozens dead, and as the culmination of all this, the resignation of the country's prime minister. In fact, the level of violence has become so extreme that some images, the most graphic ones of course, I won't even be able to show here. As usual, you can find them on my Telegram channel or at Liusibaya altogether, just like the rest of my social media. And it's worth noting that such incredibly unbelievable events appear there. Like, for example, the wife of the country's former prime minister who passed away due to the burns she suffered, because a group of protesters went to burn down her home, and they actually did it. Other images show at that time still the country's Minister of Finance being dragged to a kind of stream where the same protesters wanted to bring him to justice. It's no longer clear or understandable whether it's civil or divine. Ultimately, violence, 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 and more violence. Of course, it's absolutely essential to point out that the digital veto was only the trigger for what had been brewing for years, at the very least within Nepalese society. And the thing is, for a very long time, as I said, people had been seeing their own government as deeply corrupt and nepotistic. And of course, things couldn't go on like that for much longer. In Nepal, in addition, there is a lot of immigration. In fact, it might be one of the Asian countries with the most immigration. Since the young people of the country, because of the situation there, are forced to emigrate to other places in Asia, millions of young people go to work in India, Malaysia, the Gulf, if they find opportunities there, to improve their personal and professional lives. Social media for them, therefore, was much more than just a place to upload photos and videos. It was their window to the world, the thread that connected them with the rest of humanity, which has been taken away from them in an instant. And now it seems because of that they are facing, among other things, of course, the consequences. Taking social media away from young people was like extinguishing their last spark of hope. But instead of demonstrating and protesting against this ban, what they are really protesting against is a system that no longer works or represents them. The internal reasons seem to be more or less clear. But what about the geopolitical significance of what is happening in Nepal? Nepal? I should emphasize that we're not just talking about any country, but a buffer state between world powers as important as China and India. Both countries, of course, have been working tirelessly for decades to control and influence the most valuable part of Nepal. In this sense, it could be said that India has made somewhat greater progress. It is the country that controls most of Nepal's trade, more than 70%. In fact, it also controls the fuel and basic goods that reach the country. And for New Delhi, it is absolutely essential that the situation inside Nepal is as stable as possible, because that is what ensures, redundantly, its security and power. Of course, also the economic benefit. China, of course, is not falling behind by any means. Beijing's golden dream is to connect South Asia with Tibet, and with that to achieve greater security and, of course, also greater geopolitical and economic influence in the region. And in this sense, it is trying to carry out multiple investment projects, especially in infrastructure, within a project called the Belt and Road Initiative. That is, every crisis in Kathmandu inevitably turns into the obvious question, who gains more influence, China or India? And right now, with what's happening in Nepal, a vacuum is being created that without a doubt, both countries are going to try to fill by any means necessary. But this is where a third player also comes in. Of course, we weren't going to forget about such an extremely important international player, who, as you know, is involved in almost everything that's going on in the world. Let's remember that what's happening right now in Nepal actually started with the ban on Western social networks. Nepal's government said it was due to unmet registration requirements. But what matters to us here is that soft power, the gentle power, that it exerts over practically the entire world. Yes, social networks are a fundamental lever of control, and now in Nepal this is becoming perfectly clear. But not only that. What is the West trying to achieve with this destabilization of Kathmandu society? Basically, to replace China. The fewer points Beijing has, the better. For Uncle Shah, yes, the United States has a lot to gain here, and really, for now at least, it seems like they don't care. What will the consequences be? Is chaos alone enough? And in the midst of all this chaos, a single name emerges: Valendra Valensha, civil engineer, rapper, and the current mayor of Kathmandu. In 2022, he faced the official Western powers of the country in elections and beat them, becoming a kind of symbol of transparency, honesty, and the fight against corruption. And it is precisely him whom the young people are now proposing to become the next prime minister of the country. He hasn't taken the step yet, but whatever he does, one thing is clear. He has already become the people's hero, the face of renewal, and therefore the greatest enemy of the traditional powers. To finish painting the picture, now before us, and above all, before the civil society of Nepal, three main possible scenarios are opening up. First of all, that there is indeed a deep reform within the country and its political system. First of all, which is what the protesters seem to be demanding. Secondly, that there is even more repression and therefore very likely even more violence. Or is there also a possible third option, that the country might rather become involved in a kind of geopolitical game where China, India, and the West try to divide their influence within it? The crisis in Nepal therefore began with what seemed like a simple veto by the Socialist Republic in the country. But it's turning out to be much more than that. We're talking about the generation gap on one hand, and on the other, a country sunk in the pit of corruption. And of course, the geopolitical struggle between several major international players at the same time. And the big question we should ask ourselves, therefore, is it real within the country? Or is it just one more chapter in the endless struggle of several international powers at the same time?